go.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get an autographed copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator, but also to all different kinds of services on there. Like if you think your spouse is cheating on you, your boyfriend or your girlfriend might be stepping out on you, you give us their email address, and we trace it back to online dating websites, and we catch them cheating online. Locates, asset searches, background reports, adoption investigations, all kind of fun stuff there at emailrevealer.com. Okay. I really want to thank our guest today. We have Simon Wells, and he's the author of the book Charles Manson, Coming Down Fast. He's over there in the UK, and he's written a whole bunch of books about the Beatles, about the Stones, all kinds of fascinating topics that our audience is totally into. But it was really kind of back and forth to schedule this for me and make time for me today. So I really want to thank you, Simon, for really going out of your way and making time for me today. I really do appreciate it because I was kind of a pest. Kind of pestering you a little bit there yesterday. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Simon. Can you tell us about yourself? Who is Simon Wells?
Who is he, indeed? Simon Wells was not part of the 1960s. I think that's my main drive, is that I was I sort of came to life in the 70s, and I have since nursed this upset as not being part of the 60s. So, like for many of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, we look back on the 60s and think, oh, I wish I'd been part of that. So, the next best thing is to become a fan of the decade. And then obviously, I translated that into writing. So, I'm a full-time writer, and I'm also a musician as well, but my income derives from writing, which I thoroughly enjoy, and I'm lucky enough to be able to write about subjects which fascinate me, which is a rare treat.
Yeah, it really is, and you get to meet the most interesting people too. And travel places and stuff. It is a treat. Yeah. I'm 55 myself, so I know what you're talking about. Yeah, right. How old are you?
Same.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. And I grew up to fascinated by that time, and then I actually went. In the late 70s, I joined up with the Yippies in New York City on Lower East Side, who were kind of like left over, kind of the last...
So did you must have met David Peel then, yeah?
Oh, met David Peel many times. Okay, David Peel, sure.
Cool.
Oh, that's right, he just passed. That's right, he just passed.
Yeah, that's right, just recently, yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping to get an interview with him before,
Bummer.
Yeah, I know, but he never got back to me, though. But in my childhood show, we used to run into David Peel all the time. So... this book here, Charles Manson, Coming Down Fast. Now, it's kind of sort of like the negative side of the 60s. How'd you land in that area?
It's anyone who's a student of the 60s comes across Charles Manson. I mean, he is popularly, if I can say that right, he's sort of been cast as the bogeyman, the man who drew the curtain over the 60s. And I'm a big Beatles fan, so, again, you bump into Manson on the Beatle track. He's tied up with that as well. What interests me a lot, as someone who sort of is fascinated by the truth and is very skeptical of myth-making, of course, which in the 60s is largely a myth, this was the world's most famous serial killer and mass murderer who really never murdered anyone. And that, to me, stuck out. And the fact that people bought that, you only have to go on to, I don't know, was it CN or whatever the crime channel is, to find Manson lumped in with all the other serial killers. And so that was an interesting point for me. And equally, as someone who, probably like yourself, I actually grew up in a left field community and sort of hung out with a lot of travelers and hippies and whatnot. I've met quite a lot of Charles Manson characters in my time. Not necessarily involved with murder, but certainly hugely involved with spouting BS, influencing young people, mediocre buskers, handing out drugs, living in communes, teepees, benders, buses, the whole kit and caboodle. So, to me, the Manson story, sans murder, wasn't that unusual. It was just, and Manson, again, was not someone that I'd come across a lot of people like him in the alternative community. So, I had an opportunity, a few years ago now, but I had an opportunity to really get to grips with it. And so I decided, rather than the raft of books, which just all concentrate on Manson the maniac, Manson the murderer, Manson the lunatic, I thought I'd actually take the complete opposite and actually try and demystify, deconstruct the mythology, and just present Manson as what I saw him as a, sort of mediocre busker, had influence over young people. I mean, we've all, been in pubs and bars at a certain age, and there's always this guy who's either come out of prison or he's got he's a drug dealer, and he sort of speaks your language when you're a teenager. To me, that was Manson, and I don't see the story that fantastic at all. Obviously, the murders, which he's obviously associated with, or largely associated with, that's a different thing. But that to me also was unusual, because as we know in LA, and like other sort of crime hotbeds around the world, people die every single day from gang murders, and I had to check the murder figures from LA from the 60s. It's nothing sort of shocking. So why did this one story stick out? So then we get into celebrity, and Sharon Tate. I mean, people might think I'm being insensitive, but again, my whole brief was to literally just hone this down, strip away all this guffaw and this hysteria. Sharon Tate if she had not been involved in these murders, would we be talking about this now? I think not, So it really is a tale of celebrity and hysteria, and I wanted just to strip that back.
That's fascinating, because when you were talking, I remembered, because I remember as a little kid, when the story first hit the newspapers, back then we had newspapers, right? And first hit on the news, I remember, because in our neighborhood, we had those long-haired kids, and they were smoking pot. We knew they were up to something. We knew the Beatles. We knew something was going on, because I was a young kid. And I remember when these murders came out, my mother was saying, well, what are those kids up to? And she said, they take these drugs and they get a picture in their mind of someone they have to kill, and then they have to go kill that person. And rational people, believe that kind of thing, Maybe that was
Manson really was the guy who killed the hippie dream, because I spoke to many people in the counterculture after the Manson murders broke, and they said if you had long hair and a beard, and you were viewed with huge suspicion.
Yeah.
So he really finished it off, the whole hippie dream. But again, he didn't finish it off. It was the media which, elevated him to this near messiah status, which, of course, when you send that message out on the wires, people everywhere, in their little towns and, villages and hamlets or in cities, that, right, he's a hippie. I never thought Manson really was a hippie. He never actually called himself a hippie. He called himself a slippy. And his brief was to slip under the consciousness of the hippies, because they were so sort of complacent. And, so again, there's so many contradictions at play here. But, the popular personification of Manson, the maniac, the murderer, the messiah, the crazed messiah, has endured. And as I said to you, before we spoke, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Manson's great copy. I mean, he's the lunatic. And of course, now he's accepted that role, So when you see the interviews in prison with the swastika and the shaved head and, the crazy stuff, all going on, he's accepted that part. He was never really like that. He's become what the prosecution wanted him to be.
Well, and then tell us, what did you find that he was really like? Because we know he was kind of involved in the music industry and stuff like that with the Beach Boys and stuff and Terry Melcher. What did you find about the real Manson?
Okay. Manson was... Manson is a creation of the 60s. I don't think there's any other decade in the 20th century that would have allowed him a voice. And to me, his timing was impeccable, to be released in March 1967 in LA and then to make his way up to Haight-Ashbury. This for him was just an incredible moment. And of course, as we know in Haight-Ashbury, in that summer of love, people were given a voice. And someone like Manson, who would have been just otherwise sort of pretty much ignored as a hobo or tramp, was they used to call him, what was it, the gardener in Haight-Ashbury, so the guy who planted seeds in young people's heads, all these hundreds of thousands of people gravitating to San Francisco looking for an answer. And of course, you've got this guy who's just come out of prison. He's got that collateral of being slightly edgy. He sings. He plays guitar. His songs were unusual. They definitely were unusual for the time. Many of the lyrics that he put in his songs were sort of filched from his delving into Scientology, which again, is pretty primitive stuff at that point. So there was. These are quite, if your listeners want to go onto YouTube, you'll find all these sessions that he did way back in 67, 68. And they're unusual songs. So, I'm of the belief that actually more than anything, he wanted to be a successful musician. And he, as is evident from his fraternization with people in the music industry, it was after some sort of record contract. People have said to me, no, he wasn't. And I said, well, you're chasing the likes of Neil Young and Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher and others. There's something going on here, So I think really his main thing at that point was to assume some sort of status as a songwriter, singer-songwriter, of which there was quite a few at the time. So I think that, as we know with anyone who plays a guitar, especially amongst teenagers, it gave him another side to his personality. So it was quite a package, as they say, back then. And this is the other thing, which he really wasn't a maniac, because if he was a maniac, nobody would have hung around him. It's the other point, I'm sort of pains to point out that he was actually a very likable, engaging, charismatic individual that young people were drawn to him, like a bit of a Pied Piper. So, it can't have been all bad. If it had been all bad, there would be only maybe one or two people around him. So, he was a very likable guy. I encourage your listeners to try and find his first recording session at Universal in September 1967, which is online. And you have, in between these songs, a very happy, smiling, evidently character who's, just a likable individual. So I found that interesting. It certainly went against the grain of everything else I've been told. But evidently, if he was a creepy, nasty, vicious sort of character, there would be no followers. So that was the attraction. Another, without going too far off tangent, he had obviously his commune, which established itself on the fringes of Los Angeles the following year. And there was a very eminent journal in San Francisco called the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, which commissioned a study on community living and group commune living. And of all the hundreds of communes that are sprung up around the hinterlands of San Francisco, right through northern and southern California, they chose Manson's commune to do a feature on. So, this is against the grain of what went on later. And that's much like the hippie dream, much like, as anyone who's lived in communes or in alternative communities, there are such things as severe downers. And that came later. But certainly at the beginning, no, he was a likable individual. and was a jovial character. So I found that fascinating, to be honest with you, and I wanted to give that as much space as possible because, again, all the previous accounts of Manson, where he was a nutcase, a lunatic, but as I said, no one would hang around him. So.
Well, a couple of questions.
Things definitely did change.
You mentioned that someone did a study or a book. Who was it that did the study of his commune?
Your listeners may know of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which was a sort of very eminent alternative medical clinic, which was run by some by doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, and they had a house journal called the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. Okay. And they commissioned this study into commune life and chose Manson's commune. So, as I say, Manson was probably well known, and the group commune structure, I think the actual article was called. So they were taken seriously. They actually were taken seriously early on. Again, I didn't know this, and I think it was important to highlight that.
Yeah, I never heard of that. And it's interesting, too, because the picture we have of Manson was framed by Vincent Bugliosi,
Correct.
And then we look at his later life, and we see how he has this theory of, Lee Harvey Oswald being the lone gunman. The guy actually obviously has an agenda, you know what I mean, and what he wants to present to us. I don't think that could be...
Yeah, very fair point. And Bugliosi had a... I mean, if one wants to, again, take it out of context... Bugliosi had a very difficult job trying to convict Manson of, 9 counts of first-degree murder when he wasn't involved with any of them, or certainly involved in the murders, I should say. So he had to construct a theory around Manson. And it was very shaky, tenuous, I think, that he managed to successfully bring that about. Certainly Manson was an accessory and a likely possible conspiratorial role, but that's really it. And I think those charges, if they've been brought reasonably, may well have put Manson in for maybe 5 or 6 years in jail on accessory conspiracy charges, not 9 counts of first-degree murder and a death sentence. But as I say, the prosecutor, Manson wasn't present at these murders, so to this day, I still think that's questionable.
Yeah, if it wasn't for this mind control theory, and this cult figure type controlling other people, which was unusual litigation even for the time, you're right. What could they have really got on this guy? And if this was just a regular drug gang, like the Crips or the Bloods, how much could they have gotten away with in the same situation, prosecution-wise?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a situation which basically there was a sort of a moral panic around these murders, and I think that while obviously the people who committed the murders, there was no question about it. As one lawyer once said to me, this wasn't a whodunit, it was a whydunit. And I think that's really interesting because, as I say, I think it was my research is, I went as deep as I could on this. This really wasn't a masterminded hit or a drug hit or anything. It was a knee-jerk reaction to rejection. And it was also tied in with, it was the grubby end of, again, without going too deep into it, but as someone who's experienced commune life and alternative left field communities, when things go down, they go down quite fast, hence my title of my book, Coming Down Fast. And, like anything associated with the drug culture, you get incredible highs and you get frightening lows. And really, these murders came out of a frightening low and a period where Manson's commune was splintering, fracturing, and deconstructing. This wasn't any great, what the prosecutor wanted to call it, helter-skelter murders to start a race war, and where Manson can take control of the world. I mean, that is complete and utter nonsense. It was a grubby, disappointing set of circumstances which allowed this knee-jerk reaction to enact this horror without any real mastermind. You know, I mean, people have said to me, "Oh, it was a drug hit," and the mob had engaged Manson's tribe to sort of rip off the drug dealers and that were surrounding certain Hollywood personalities. You know, in my experience of criminals, there's no way the mob will trust Manson and his family with anything. The one drug burn that a character named Tex Watson did prior to the murders was so sloppy and hideous that there's no way that they would be entrusted with that. I think it's an affront to actually even believe that. So that was my take on it, you know, to strip it right back down. And then to see that what you have is this, you know, just a guy who's probably, you know, the whole notion of the so-called Manson family, you know, that if you really want to talk about cult leaders, you know, talk about Jim Jones, you know. The Manson cult at the time of the murders had probably whittled itself down to maybe a hardcore of 8 or 10, with the flotsam and jetsam of associated characters that always hung around them, who were just usually there for drugs or sex. So I don't call that a cult. I call that just a band of no-hopers, really.
You know, it's interesting. I just had a friend recently here in Vegas. She's a local artist. Wonder Hussey, her name is Sarah Jane Woodall. And it says YouTube channel too as well. It's a local artist model. And she took a trek out there to Barker Ranch, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And hiked out there as far as she could get, and took the truck out there as far as she could get. Now, how many people, it was like 10 that made it out to Barker Ranch? Because that's a pretty remote area to convince a group of people. And they got a bus out there too somehow.
Yeah, they did indeed. The Gola Wash. I mean, it's the hardest place in the world to go to. At that point, Manson's commune was and Manson himself were really starting to splinter. There was also criminality started coming into this so-called family, bikers and drug dealers. I think Manson was feeling the heat, so the whole notion of going out to the desert was a sort of an attempt really to sort of escape the lawmakers who were bearing down on them. So it was probably maybe 10 to 20 people out there, and people sort of arriving, because obviously, you know, the word was out that there was this thing going on. But, you know, the conditions out there are not conducive to living, full stop. I mean, it's an impossible place to live, and to sustain yourself, I mean, it would be impossible. So it was more of a dream. I mean, you know, the whole thing of this also is the whole LSD landscape, you know, was people were trying to process it into a reality. Manson was no different in that, you know, and so, you know, the big skies and hallucinogenic landscapes that LSD creates in your head, you know, people think, well, we can live that out. Well, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. So, you know, it was just his little idea to move things away. This move was also in tandem with his rejection by the music community. So, you know, that was a big element in what was going on. Huge element, you know, because Manson had basically he had some initial interest by various celebrated people, but again, you know, I mean, he brought with him a caravan of young girls that were recording sessions, but, you know, people quite liked that. That was not an issue. The real problem was that Manson's music, when you saw him with the girls singing along and all the rest of it, was fascinating. When you bounced it down onto tape, it didn't do much. It wasn't really commercial, and that was the main reason that they decided not to go ahead with it. Yes, they were a little bit spooked by his behavior, but ultimately, commercially, it really wasn't going to do too much. So I think they tried, and I know Terry Melcher had said that they tried every avenue to sort of try and present Manson's music above and beyond the busking presence which he had, and it just didn't work. And at the end of the day, someone had to tell him that, which led to led this whole sense of rejection, which Manson had since a child, that weighed heavily. And again, that was really one of the kickstarts for the sort of horror that unfolded.
Now, his connection to the music industry, did you find any connections to the Beatles? Because there is that story about how the Beatles lyrics were painted on the doorway there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All good children go to heaven. What did you find out about his connections with the Beatles?
Yeah, I mean, I was led to believe for a few people that Manson was enchanted by the Beatles, mainly because they came from humble beginnings, and I think he sort of saw a parallel there, that he could actually he came from humble beginnings. And, by 1967, the Beatles had dropped their mop-top personas, and they were sort of into being quite creative with their lyrics. And I think Manson identified with a lot of that. Their original bus, which they used to go around North and South California, was a magical mystery tour. So, they were very much, I think, following in that same line as the Beatles. But it was the Beatles' White Album. It was actually in the UK. It was just called The Beatles, believe it or not. That Manson drew a direct line with. Now, we're entering into quite sort of a strange territory here, but this was not unusual in the 60s for people to be reading stuff into records. There was a big thing that Paul McCartney was dead, and if you played an album backwards, you heard this, you heard the Beatles saying he's dead, and all sorts of clues. Everybody was dissecting everything at that point, so it wasn't unusual. That Manson went a step further, and as I said, the interesting thing is that as the result of excessive LSD use and with a possibility that there was a pre-existing mental health condition, I think possibly maybe low-level schizophrenia, Manson actually felt that the Beatles were talking to him. So we are told. I mean, again, the prosecutor made a big thing of this. Having sat around campfires myself with people smoking dope and talking all sorts of nonsense, I've equally heard people saying that people are talking to them through records. So it's not that unusual. And certainly in the counterculture, you hear all sorts of stories that rock groups are supposedly communicating things to people. A lot of it, which is nonsense. But again, the Manson family and Manson was no different to those sorts of people. So, but again, the prosecutor made a big thing that the Beatles' White Album, Manson had read into several tracks that there was an impending race war that was going to make itself known, that the Beatles were aware of it. And there's a couple of tracks which Manson apparently saw, some quite, to him it was convincing forewarning that the apocalypse was going to happen. One was Helter Skelter, which, if you really want to know the origins of Helter Skelter, Paul McCartney wrote it about a fairground ride, and it was a fairground ride with a crude sexual analogy of coming down from the top and going down to the bottom. But Manson saw it as far deeper than that. He apparently drew a connection with the biblical passage called Revelation, in effect, Revelation 9, where this hole to the bottomless pit where the apocalypse would start. I mean, it's quite fantastic in its literal sense of the word. But there's a couple of things which resonated with Manson's ambient schizophrenia, which they had a girl. He used to rename all the girls, and one of the girls was called Sadie, and Sexy Sadie. Well, he'd been calling this girl this for 6 months or so, and then of course the Beatles come along with a song called Sexy Sadie. So that confirmed part of that. And Manson also was interested in the Bible and had quoted often this biblical passage called Revelation 9. And of course, what do the Beatles do? They record a track on the White Album called Revolution 9. And I don't know if you've heard it. I'm sure,
Sure.
Your listeners can check it out. It's a sort of collage, a melange of sounds, and it's like a patchwork of all various sorts of sounds. And to Manson, it was sort of, it's a soundtrack to the apocalypse. He said he could hear the word rise being shouted out in it, and if you actually listen to it, it does sound like someone's shouting out rise. In fact, going deeper into it, it's John Lennon shouting out "All right," which is he clipped from the recording of Revolution, the song "You Say You Want a Revolution." At the end, it just dissolves into "All right, all right, all right," and he clipped that and stuck it on Revolution 9, but it sounds like "Rise." This also chimes with a song of Paul McCartney's called "Blackbird." Blackbird singing in the dead of night, you've been waiting for your moment to arise. Well, again, that played into it. So he drew this sort of connection with it. And I think ultimately that, to many of his followers who were all whacked out a lot of the time, it made some sort of sense. But as I'm always at pains to point out, no connection had been drawn between murder at that point. I think this is stoned campfire dribble. This is the sort of stuff that people just spout out if you hang out with the alternative community.
But let me ask you specifically, those lyrics, were they painted on that door before the album came out or after?
Right. Well, what you were quoted earlier, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 all tunes. Yeah, no, that actually came out on Abbey Road, and Abbey Road wasn't released till September 1969. So that was after the murders. They found that door at the Sparns Ranch, which was the Manson Ranch, way after the murders. But the one Beatles lyric which was far more telling was "Helter Skelter," which was actually written in blood on one of the victims' refrigerators.
Right.
Albeit they spelt it wrong. It was Healter, Heal, Helter Skelter. But this is interesting. We're skipping ahead a bit here, but this is really quite interesting because the police, when they did their report on that night of murder at the La Biancas in Los Angeles, they didn't report the fact to the media that Helter Skelter, or Rise for that matter, had been written on the wall. And given Manson had been spouting his Helter Skelter theories around music community and everywhere, I've always been of the belief that had actually been issued that night. Manson and his cohorts would have been behind bars within a few hours. I also think that the girl, Patricia Grenwinkle, who wrote that on the refrigerator and then reported that back to Manson, was the sole reason why the murder stopped and that they cleared off, because Manson, being a jailbird and a pretty seasoned one at that, would realize that Helter Skelter would immediately send everyone his way. So again, it's not a very clever band of criminals, It's remarkable that it took so long to bring them all to book. I think it was just sloppiness, and the police intoxicated a completely different angle to what eventually people were called for.
Let me ask you a question. Now, you mentioned earlier about his dabbling with Scientology, right? Now, what do we know about that? Was he just getting the initial auditing, or did he actually pay for classes with Scientology?
No, actually what happened is he was on a long stretch in Terminal Island, and he had he realized at one point, this is a sort of defining epiphany for him, that he'd been, the other thing I was pointing about Manson, he wasn't a very good criminal. He kept getting caught, So he's on this 10-year stretch for passing a bad check, and he realized that actually at some point, that you're facing that long stretch, you've got to try and do something with your time. And there happened to be a Scientologist who was serving time there as well, who was holding unofficial lectures, auditing sessions in Scientology in the prison. So, according to this guy, Manson had 150 hours of auditing, which is an intense amount of Scientology input. And as I say, I think that, again, Scientology is another issue completely, but it does look into the psyche. It does sort of look at survival and ego dynamics. And I think that found great favor with Manson. So he did apparently, allegedly, when he was released, he did actually go to a celebrity center, or one of the centers in Los Angeles, and kept an interest in that. Whether he'd read Dianetics, I imagine he must have, and Los Angeles has had a sort of strong continuum with Scientology. So, at that point, and also another story that Manson was also came across a splinter group of Scientology called the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which had an office or a chapter in San Francisco, and they also spouted more apocalyptic, more fantastic angles to Scientology, which he got involved with. So there's that as well, which all plays into the whole part of it. So, Manson ultimately was a bit of a magpie. He was pinching from Scientology, the Process, from the Beatles. I think he really cherry-picked all these very popular bits of religions and thought processes and sort of twisted them in his own direction.
Now, are you familiar with the work of Maury Terry, the book The Ultimate Evil?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, because when you look at the Process Church with their connections to the Son of Sam cult in New York City, was kind of to create chaos, kind of like a helter-skelter and a race war kind of thing with that, okay? It sort of fits in with the Process Church being connected to Manson in L.A. Are you familiar with the INS document, the INS report that Terry had that said that the Manson family girls were sewing Process emblems into their blankets while they were in prison there?
I had to really check this one out because it's never really been challenged. I believe what Maury Terry wrote was utter nonsense. And I was lucky enough to track down one of the original Process guys, who actually is an English guy who was over there. And it confirmed to me that I believe the Process Church actually took action against...
No, that was Sanders. Yeah, it's Sanders, yeah.
Yeah. As I say, I don't see... Other than people like Manson sort of passing their way, I don't think the Process Church were involved in ritualized slaughter and anything at all. And in fact, they were the head of the Process Church, Robert de Grinston, and his wife Mary Ann, were quite passive individuals. They had a love of animals, and in fact, I think to this day there's still an animal sanctuary bearing their name or the Process name. It was Terry's stuff sort of joined dots together, which I don't think were particularly. They couldn't really be challenged. It was interesting, as I say. I really nailed down this guy who was out there, and they were a very innocent group of people because they used to have a magazine, the Process Church, and they thought it would be awfully fun to have an issue called Murder. I think it was not Death, that was Death, where they actually managed to get someone inside where Manson was waiting charges. They managed to get him to write a feature on death. And, of course, then people just connected the two. But when I spoke to the guy, and again, someone, Timothy Wiley, his name was, he's still around, he just said that it was just the innocence of the time that you would try and, you get someone who's been convicted of murder to write about death. It was no more than that. But then, of course, what it does, it sends out these vibrations and signals to other more opportunist individuals who want to link the two together. So Timothy told me that as far as he was concerned, Manson certainly was in the vicinity of the Process Church chapter in San Francisco. I don't remember him at any meetings. He may well have popped in and grabbed some literature, and that really is about it. I've got no other... and actually someone's just made a very good film about the Process, which I helped contribute to, and no one there of all the existing Process ever remembers Manson. The only reason they're connected to him is because of this article he wrote for their magazine.
Okay, but we know that the Son of Sam cult was involved in murders in New York City. That wasn't innocent. And they were involved in animal sacrifices.
But was that linked to the Process Church?
Well, you have Manson, Berkowitz, his connection to Roy Radin. Roy Radin was murdered by Bill Manson, and the connection to, I believe there's many connections to Process.
Okay, as far as I was aware, I think most of them that Terry did were just made up or certainly embellished, or As I say, my brief was with Manson, so it was not something I could really go down that road. But as I will say categorically, as far as Manson's concerned, the only connection he had with them was ambient at best.
And you've never seen that INS report that connects Manson to the Process Church, and also connects to that Sirhan, the assassin.
I think I must have read it in the Terry book, but because there were so many inaccuracies and falsehoods and fantasies, as far as I could see, I didn't really pay too much attention to it. I mean, it's easy. It's very, very easy to, if we're dealing with criminals, you can write anything you want about them. I really had to bear down on hard facts rather than suppositions. And as I say, I dismissed Terry's book because I just felt it was just it didn't ring true for me. In as much as Ed Sanders' book didn't, I have grave suspicions on if it's not referenced or the characters are unreliable. And my God, some of the characters associated with the Mansons are less than reliable.
Did you run across any information about Sirhan attending parties at I forget the woman's name, Polanski's wife.
At the Sharon Tate?
Yeah, attending parties at Sharon Tate's home there, and sex parties and drug parties that also included the Process Church. Are you familiar with that document?
Well, again, there was absolutely no... and people get confused as well, because obviously the Process Church actually originated in London.
Right.
That was where it started. And there were Process members in London who were sort of fraternized, who were around... they were around everybody, but there was a sort of certain set around Polanski. But it was no more than that, from what I could see. And definitely the Seattle Drive house where the murders were, I had absolutely no information to lead that any of the Process Church were involved with that. The so-called sex parties, which Polanski and Tate and Peter Sellers and Yulbryn and all these characters were supposedly involved with, again, I feel that's been embellished as well. There was obviously parties, there was obviously drugs, and there was obviously sex, but to the sadomasochist parties of people being whipped and all sorts of stuff, I think it's just people's lively imaginations, to be honest with you.
And what about filming porn there? What did you come up with that?
With what, sorry?
Like they were filming pornography.
Well, I spoke to one of the detectives there that, because there was long considered to be pornographic films. This was Ed Sanders' territory, I think, had actually pointed this out originally. The only film they actually found was a home video of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate making love, and it was apparently very basic, or probably for their own use. The one thing I will say, though, in the 40, 50 years since this story emerged, I would have expected some photographs or some film to have surfaced, in that period. I would have expected more than just suspicion to have surfaced. I'm not really convinced that there was anything really of the level that they were suggesting. Where they got their lines crossed, Sharon Tate was involved in a film called The Eye of the Devil in 1964, where she was involved in an occult. It was a sort of very much a B movie where she played an occult woman in a cult somewhere in France, I think it was. When the murders broke, the press got hold of these photos of her dressed up with sort of, regalia, and said she was involved with them. Well, it was all pinched from that movie, Again, it's again the whole thing of myth-making. So I don't believe, how can one comment on something when it's only been suggested? There's no proof, there's no evidence. The police did a thorough search and they found that one videotape. And from what I know is that the videotape was viewed and then it was placed back in the place they found it, in the loft of the Seattle Drive house. So I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Again, I would if I saw it or saw a real cogent reference to it.
Okay, then what was the motive for the murder, and why did they pick those victims?
That's a very good question, and it's one which, over the years has taxed minds, or people have drawn conclusions. the reason for the murders. A ambient member of the Manson family, a character called Bobby Beausoleil, had been involved in a drug deal that had gone wrong. And through a series of circumstances, that the character who was Beausoleil was acting as a sort of fence between this guy and a group of bikers, and the dealer manufacturer would not refund the money, and just things got wrong, and Beausoleil and a couple of other people attached to Manson who used to hang out at this guy's house. The guy was murdered. Manson knew about it, and he decided to clear off after that. And when he got back to Sparns Ranch, it was the news that the character Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested, and they found the blood. So Manson was apoplectic, was aware that obviously because he was loosely associated to this so-called Manson cult, it would probably fall back on him. Manson had been aware at a place called Esalen, which is a New Age institute at Big Sur,
Sure.
and he'd been trying to preview his music there with little interest. So he was on a major downer. In his absence, the girls at the ranch had cooked up an idea that if they committed a copycat murder to the murder of this character, whose name is Gary Hinman, that it would, with Beausoleil in custody, it would defer attention from it. And from what I painstakingly researched to Manson's movements, he arrived back at the ranch in Big Sur at around 2-3 o'clock at the afternoon of August 8. He just green-lighted it. I believe he said, "Fine, we'll just find somewhere and we will kill them brutally, and we'll draw signs on the doors and the walls." What they'd done with the murder of Gary Hinman to defer initial attention was to write on the wall of Hinman's house a political piggy in blood, so hoping that the Black Panthers would be implicated with it. So with Beausoleil incarcerated, they thought if they do another murder similar and paint these sort of witchy signs or strange signs, that it obviously couldn't be Beausoleil and be freed. I mean, it's completely innocent nonsense, but that is the level of their intelligence. That's what we were working with, not the Messiah who's calculating this murder spree. And so why the victims? The only if it was Terry Melcher who'd rejected me on the music, well, Melcher had moved, and Manson knew he'd moved. I strongly believe that the reason that the murders were committed in Cielo Drive was, one, it was an isolated community, and two, the house was at the end of the drive. Manson is a sort of, as I say, a seasoned jailbird. You wouldn't commit a murder in a busy residential street. You would find somewhere which would allow you an easy exit. Manson knew of the house. Several of the girls had gone swimming there when Terry Melcher was there, and Tex Watson, the chief hatchet man that night, knew. So they knew the layout. It was at the end of the drive, so it would allow a swift exit. And in, again, a knee-jerk way, the house symbolized the community which had rejected Manson's music. Yeah, so it was symbolic. I don't think they actually cared or knew exactly who was there. There was no one there really who had really actually sort of rejected Manson in any way, or any of the people. They were not pivotal in any way to his music career. So my own feeling is that they chose that house purely because it was isolated at the end of the drive and would allow, not too much attention. So that's my feeling on that.
So basically at random.
Random-ish. I mean, it was random to me suggests anywhere. To me, it was the people were random, definitely. The victims were random, at random. There was nothing there that would have linked Manson with Sharon Tate, really. You may have come across her, but she hadn't sort of rejected him or anything, or any of the other characters. So ultimately, I think it was more a case of the location, and also, you know, as I said, that it did symbolize. I think one of Manson's quotes, when someone said, when they got back, you know, he said, "Oh, well, they're just a bunch of movie stars," or something like that. So I don't think he really cared. I mean, obviously a lot of movie stars in Beverly Hills, but as I say, I think they knew the location. They knew it. I don't think there was anything there that would suggest that, other than just it being a symbol of the world that had rejected Manson. And also, you know, Manson had also gone along with this sort of copycat idea. He probably thought it was probably a good idea. Again, if he'd been planning this, he kept it pretty quiet. He didn't know about Bobby Beausoleil's arrest until that afternoon. So, you know, that's quite a short time to sort of mastermind something like this. But you know, it's if it was a mob hit, you know, if it was a mob there was drugs and whatnot up there, I think they wouldn't have been as sloppy as this. You know, this was pretty, you know, painting signs all over the place and blood everywhere, and they wrote "pig" on the door of the house in Sharon Tate's blood. I should say Susan Atkins did.
Let me ask you a question. Back to Bobby Beausoleil for a second, because he wound up working on a film with Kenneth Anger. Do you know how that came about?
Yeah, well, I mean, Beausoleil's a hugely talented musician, composer, who prior to any association with Manson was a bit of a mover and shaker in both LA and San Francisco, and he sort of hooked up with Kenneth Anger prior to any Manson connection, and was living in his... Anger had this old house which was once a Russian consulate in San Francisco. I think Anger was fascinated with Beausoleil, and Beausoleil was a promiscuous talent for his young years, you know. So yes, he worked on Invocation of My Demon Brother, I think it was, or Lucifer Rising. No, it was Lucifer Rising, yeah. That film, yeah. Of which I think he finished off the soundtrack in jail eventually. Right. I mean, it's so crazy, but yeah, he was. I mean, I spoke to Bobby a few times in the preparation for the book, and you know, I think he was sorry he got mixed up with Manson. I think the only reason he really came into Manson's orbit was because of the music. You know, the pair of them were. Well, I think Beausoleil was reasonably established, and Manson was budding, was a budding, you know, go-getting musician. So, you know, and they did a record. I found out they did a recording session together in some, I think it was Gold Star, somewhere quite eminent. So there was a link there, but I don't think Beausoleil was part of the Manson family. He just got hooked up with bad company, basically.
But you would describe Kenneth Anger as a Satanist, right?
Would I describe Kenneth Anger as a Satanist?
Yeah.
Left field, interested in Satan. I wouldn't say an actual card-carrying Satanist.
Okay.
But I'd say that he was definitely of the left field. I think he definitely was interested in that. You know, like a lot of those artists, you know, there's a real... fascination, and especially in the 60s, you know, where anything goes, you know. But I've no idea if he's a practicing Satanist.
Okay, and the film, I think he described himself as a practicing Satanist, but now also too, the film...
He may well have done, yeah, I haven't come across it.
The film Lucifer Rising actually there's a death of one of the actors in the film, and they kept it in the film.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't know that?
I didn't know about the death of an actor. I mean, that's a crime scene.
Yeah, well, it was, I think it was a motorcycle accident. Like a stunt. Right. Fascinating, and they kept it in the film. Now,
well, it's been yeah. I watched it once for research purposes because I think Beausoleil's in it, isn't he, to start with, and also another character, Donald Cammell, who went on to make the film Performance, is in this as well. Mick Jagger did some music for us as well, if I right remember. But it's a pretty crude home movie, if I right remember.
Hard to watch.
But no, all these elements were pulled in for the whole Manson thing, you know. So Kenneth Anger, possible Satanist. Well, then that means Manson's a Satanist. You know, it's the spirit of the time that anything goes, and we'll just drag it in. I mean, I believe Anger was terrified when the Manson thing broke, and he tried to destroy one of the films with Beausoleil, and I mean, he took him onto the desert and tried to destroy the negatives and stuff. I mean, it spooked a lot of people out, this story, you know.
Did you actually talk to Anger?
No, I didn't. I think I sent him an email and I got some strange thing back. I think he's not really talking about. He's never really talked about Manson at all. I think he's absolutely the whole Manson episode is something which even he probably couldn't envisage in his head. You know.
Now, after the murders, one of the stories out there is that Polanski suspected John Phillips, Papa Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. He suspected that he was involved, and he actually went and broke into his house looking for a copy of his handwriting to compare with the writing on the wall. What did you find in your investigation of that?
Well, he actually went further. He was putting down. He was trying to get samples of DNA and blood and everything, even in the car. I mean, the thing was that there's other weird stuff here as well, which, being Hollywood and being the 60s, there was a lot of people involved with wife swapping and stuff. Not any great thing, but I mean, and paranoias were enormous. I mean, Polanski was possibly one of the worst. He was shagging anything that moved everywhere, So I think in his heightened state, for some reason, he imagined John Phillips, who was part of that crowd with the connection with, is it Mama Cass Elliot? Yeah. Whose Mama Cass Elliot's sort of personal drug-dealing boyfriend had had visited Cielo Drive. And so they were all part of the same community. But he had a fascination with John Phillips for some strange reason. And he definitely went to the house, and he definitely was searching for bits of information, as I say, to the point of breaking into the house and into his car, looking for some sort of clues. But that's probably a height of his desperation at that point.
And then what do you make of Robert Evans and Jack Nicholson showing up, supposedly going to the house and cleaning up? What do you make of that?
I didn't find any evidence to support that at all.
Oh, really?
The Polanski house, Cielo Drive?
Yeah. I know. Robert Evans talks about it. Robert Evans himself says he said he was supposed to be babysitting Sharon Tate that night and keeping an eye on her for Polanski. Oh, yeah. And he talks about it in one of his films, in one of his interviews.
Yeah. You'd be interested to know that I found about 20 or 30 people supposed to be at the house that night.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
I mean, so many of them, and people have dined out on this story. I mean, the reality was that there was no party that night apart from the 4 people who were murdered. It's. I mean, maybe people in their heads thought that they were going to go around there, but no, and they had plenty of opportunity to go around there as well, because, as I say, the party of Jay Sebring and Wojciech Rakowski, Abigail Folger, and Sharon Tate, they went into town earlier that night for dinner, and so no, again, it's all part of the myth. I don't believe it personally.
Okay.
Why would you anyway? And also, why would you want to claim that you were invited and never went? Or I mean, that's just.
Oh, like you said, a lot of people say that, but Robert Evans himself says that he went there with Jack Nicholson to clean up the blood before Polanski came home. And it's interesting because Evans later on was involved in those Cotton Club murders, the murder of Roy Radin, who was involved in the Son of Sam cult in New York. And the hitman in that case, who's convicted in prison, was Bill Menser, who was also the bodyguard for Papa Phillips and for Mama Cass Phillips.
Well, it doesn't ring true because the timeline of the events of the murder and the discovery, the house was immediately a crime scene, and it was actually roped off by police until Polanski came back. So how they got through that and cleaned up. This story I know, which is true, which is bizarre, is that actually it was Sharon Tate's father and Roman Polanski who actually had to clean up the blood, and that's well documented. And actually even more upsetting is that they were sued by the landlord of the property.
Right.
For the damage to the property and new carpets. So I don't believe that for a minute.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time. In fact, we only got like a couple of minutes.
Okay.
What do you want to leave us with?
The Manson family is largely a mythological invention. I strongly believe that if Sharon Tate wasn't involved in this case, that we wouldn't be talking about this. This would just be a series of pretty ugly murders. The one interesting thing is that the the Manson's sort of claim for some sort of success, in a perverse way, has been realised. He probably is the world's most famous living criminal. He's outlived everyone, you know. So he got the celebrity of some sort that he wanted, but equally, you know, I think that if you strip this story away and take the hysteria out of it, it's just a mediocre busker with influence over teenagers. The other thing, which, you know, is never really been documented, is that no one of Manson's age really wanted anything to do with him. You know, he's one of those characters who really, you know, he'd been in prison half of his life, so in a sense it was a 32, 33-year-old man and his mind was 16, 17, so in a sense I think he was quite immature. But, you know, once you throw celebrity into this, once you throw Hollywood into it, let's throw in the Beach Boys, the Beatles, let's throw Satan in, let's throw everything in, then it elevates it to this crime of the century. But you take out some of those elements and you're just left with another grubby murder which happens in LA every single day. It's no different. The 60s wraps everything up in a golden glow. You know, if it happened in the 80s, it wouldn't have the same glow as this, you know. We had Woodstock just before, you know, the Beatles, we had Summer of Love, you know, all those Technicolor moments. And then Manson comes along at the end, you know, it's like a pantomime. It's like the baddie turns up and ruins it all. And then after Manson, you have Altamont, you know, the festival in San Francisco, which really, you know, that again was another curtain puller over the decade. This will all, in the next 20 or 30 years, when all the original people are not with us, it will all go largely into mythology. It'll just be a story which will be regurgitated and rewritten and embellished, and no one around to check it. And it will become folklore. And when you have folklore, then, you know, the sky's the limit. It becomes. So, you know, it's just that. My attempt was just try and rationalize it, try and make some sense out of it, so that perhaps people in the future might go, do you know, it wasn't as fantastic in the literal sense of the word as it's been made out. You know, it was just a pretty grubby scenario where a lot of people got hurt badly and made some very bad choices. So that's my take.
Simon Wells, author of Charles Manson Coming Down Fast. Once again, Simon, I can't thank you enough, man, for because, you know, making time for me today at the last minute too, and you know, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Good night. Okay, they got Simon Wells. Interesting take on the Charles Manson story. Charles Manson Coming Down Fast, friends with Timothy Wiley. What do we open up here? Okay, little can of worms there. Anyway, if you like this show, check out OppermanReport.com. What the heck is that? OppermanReport.com. And I'm working on a special, guys, right now for the members section, where if you want to sign up for a year, I'll give you 13 months for $65. We got robbed. They stole a very important camera that we've been using here, me and Victoria, in the house. So I'm trying to raise money over the weekend here to try and raise some funds to replace her camera for her. It was only a couple $100, but if you can become a member, $65, 13 months. 13 months, the mark of the beast, in honor of Kenneth Anger. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, Simon Wells, Charles Manson Coming Down Fast, and I really do, all kidding aside, want to thank Simon Wells for making time for me, because it was a real scramble to fill up time this week. And I contacted a bunch of people, and it turned out I did twice as many shows as I needed to do. But Simon Wells is a very kind man to make time for me. I know it's very late over there in the UK as we're filming this, recording this right now. So thank you so much, Simon Wells, Charles Manson, Coming Down Fast. OppermanReport.com is where the member section is. And you want to get a special deal.